right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're doing well tonight. Thanks for joining me. We got a small crew here, but hey, they are excited to talk about the Americas. We are going to be looking at a little bit about the Americas in general, and we'll be recording this and posting it up. One of the things I decided to do was this originally was going to be about Latin America, but as I was working on that, I was thinking, well, there's not quite enough for like a full 45 minutes or 50 minutes. I mean, we could probably extend it a bit, but as far as like these sort of big overview kind of things, it wasn't really going to work necessarily. And then also there were just a couple things from the North America and how it interacts with the rest of it, like how America interacts with people. So I went ahead and just threw in a few things here and there. Like obviously we could do an enormous amount just on the United States, like if we're talking about them, because we could talk about World War II or anything. So much easier to talk about those in other places instead. Okay. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started and do a little presentation on America. America. Oh, well, got a little farther ahead of myself there. All right. Let's check it out. Okay, so this is about America again. So we are going to be looking at a couple. Remember, technically, the United States is not called America. If you ever meet like Europeans or like South Americans or whatever, they get really mad if you just call us America. They're like, "What about the rest of the Americas?" So just a little tip for you there. But let's take a look here at a map for you to kind of talk about some of the terms that we're talking about the Americas, because there's a bunch of different ones. Like it's not quite as easy as like said when we talked about Africa, when we have Northwest, East, Central, South, and then Sub-Saharan, which makes sense. A lot of the stuff about America is all over the place, right? Like there's all kinds of different terms and different things and so forth. So let's talk about a couple of these real quick, okay? So one of the most obvious ones, if you look up in the in the top right there, you'll see a picture that says North America, okay? So North America is going to consist of Canada, United States, Mexico, and then Central America, right? So basically the difference between these two is going to be Panama versus Colombia. That's sort of the universal picture between North and South America. So for example, on our left here, we'll see a little space there that's in the middle that is called Central America. That's Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. And so the division line would be maybe Panama, right, where the canal is, or maybe it's part of Colombia instead, or maybe it's the border with Colombia instead. But anyway, anywhere north of that, essentially, north, like Panama and north is going to be North America. And anything south of that, of course, is going to be South America. So if you look over the picture on the left, ignore the stuff, to the north, but you'll see again, Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Brazil, etc. So that should be pretty obvious, right? We got two continents, northern and southern. I seriously doubt you would ever have a question where they're like, talking about Panama and you have to decide whether it's north or south. Like that's just not something that will necessarily happen. Okay. So it shouldn't be too difficult for you to figure out sort of how that is going to work out there. But if they did happen to have some question about Central America, don't think that's going to happen. But if they did, make sure you know what we're talking about here. One other thing that they will on occasion do as well is they will talk about the Caribbean. Okay. So the bottom down here, you can see a picture of the Caribbean there. We've got Cuba, we've got Jamaica, Hispaniola with Haiti and Dominican Republic, we've got Puerto Rico, we got all those little islands there of the Lesser Antilles, so Guadalupe and Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago and all that kind of stuff. Again, it doesn't seem likely that they would talk a whole lot about that, but, we have a couple of things here, like the Haitian Revolution or, the Cubans or whatever, that could potentially come up in some form or fashion, right? Now, on the left, then, this is going to be one of our big things to remember. This is Latin America. Okay, so that is anywhere south of the Rio Grande border. Okay, so anywhere from Texas, essentially, down to the Tierra del Fuego at the end of the earth with Chile, that's all going to qualify as Latin America. Now, that being said, the traditional point of Latin America is it is a place of Spanish speakers. Okay. Sometimes Brazil as well, because Portuguese and Spanish are very similar. So, I think like if you talked about Brazil on a test that asks a question about Latin America, I think you're probably fine. I think that there's probably better choices to choose than Brazil, but again, that's probably okay, right? However, like Haiti is a little more iffy, because it speaks French. Again, that is technically a Latin language. But I feel like at the point where they're asking a question like, talk about a revolution in Latin America, right? Like you have a lot of options. You could talk about the Mexican Revolution. You could talk about Simón de Bolivar or José de San Martín, or you could even talk about the Brazilian monarchy and sort of how they got independence, right? So like my point here is that like if it's clear that you could talk about Haiti, like if it says like Enlightenment, revolutions or something, then sure, you could easily do that. But if it says Latin America, try to find other stuff instead. If like some weird thing happens where they ask a question about Latin America and for some reason the only thing that you can think about is the Haitian Revolution, yeah, man, sure, give it a try. I don't know. I don't know if that's going to get you the points, but it's better than putting nothing. That's for sure. Okay. One thing to remember about a couple of these is that kind of the perceptual regions as well. So like North America, South America, we can probably justify those as names based upon somewhat common history, but also just like the physical features, right? But when it comes to a bunch of these other ones, they're a little more iffy, right? Like what is Central America? Well, it's just this historical grouping of countries. Like those countries at one time were trying to be their own country together, right? So that's kind of an example. The Caribbean is also kind of like, what do you call it? The Caribbean is also kind of a physical region in a sense, but the idea of Latin America is much more of a perceptual region, right? Like what do we perceive to be Latin America? There's no hard and fast kind of thing about it. So just make sure you understand that, Latin America in particular is more of a thought experiment in a sense. It's more of a place that we think about than anything else. It's very similar to the Middle East, right? Like what is the Middle East? If you ask that question, you could get like 12 different interpretations. Same thing is also true here. Like is Latin America Haiti? Would the Bahamas be included? They speak English, right? Brazil, whatever. Like that's part of the problem with it. But again, focus on the big ones and I don't think you're going to have too much of a problem with it. All right. All right. Let's take a look. As we've been doing with these other ones, we're doing it through time periods. So we'll do basically 2 slides per time period. And we'll cover kind of the real high points on this. So there's plenty of things that we're going to skip or just not talk about. Mostly, again, this is an attempt to kind of like remind you of things and try to get your brain spurred for you to do additional research. As we're going through this, please, at any time, please just pop in a question into the chat list. Or if you really want to just ask a question, you're more than welcome to do so. You can just hit the raise hand button like that, and then I'm more than happy to talk to you about it. So again, we got a lot of stuff to cover, but I want to make sure that you get what you need. Okay. Oops. All right. There we go. All right. Let's check it out. So one of the things I've been doing on the other videos, the last 2, and I'll do it in the future too, is I oftentimes include something that says like, something that's common throughout the entire period, right? So when we talked about Africa, for example, we talked a bit about kinship systems, or when we talked about East Asia, we talked about Confucianism having a lot of influence. The problem, though, for the Americas is that there's just not really a lot of that because of that drastic thing that occurs in time period 2 when the Europeans come and when so many Native American civilizations are going to end up dying and falling apart, right? So there's a big distinction between those. Also, when you get into the more modern times, like America versus, the United States versus like Brazil or whatever, there's a lot of differentiation between those as well. So it's very difficult to think of some things that are kind of universal here. Just because of the passage of time, etc. But let's check it out. Before connecting, so time period 1 is before the connecting of the world. So we got isolated empires in North and South America. Obviously, one of our biggest ones here is the Aztecs, also known as the Mexica in central Mexico. There are predecessor groups to the Aztecs. So like there's the Teotihuacans, or there's the Toltecs. Those are mostly going to come before the time period of 1200, though, so they're just not really something that we need to worry as much about. This is a large tributary empire. When we talk about politics for the Aztecs, they're not a centralized, organized empire kind of thing we think about. There's not like an emperor at the top and all these like people around them. Instead, what they have is there's a city, right? Tenochtitlan, the capital. And that city then is going to have connections to other cities that they are going to basically boss around and force tribute. So like the direct places that they control, like direct control of Tenochtitlan is not huge, right? But because they are able to force others to do their will through these kind of tributary states and things, they're going to be a lot larger than you would think. Okay. So we're going to check out a picture of that in just a minute. Of course, they have human sacrifice. They are probably one of our biggest groups for human sacrifice. They believed, again, in this thing called the 52-year cycle. The 52 years, basically, they believed every 52 years the world was going to end, that the sun was going to be gobbled up or whatever, and that the only way to prevent that was to keep the gods really strong. And the way that you keep the gods strong is through sacrifice, specifically human blood or human beings, to try to keep them powerful enough that they can fight off this thing. They had this thing called the new sun ceremony every 52 years where they would hope that the world would come back, and surprisingly it did. They have a very complex economy. One of the things that are centered around is this thing called Pochteca traders. Remember, there's not a lot of animals that are domesticated in the New World, so we have just a few. The Aztecs themselves have like dogs and turkeys and stuff, and that's about it. So they don't really have a way to make carts or whatever and have animals pull them. So instead, they have this group of traders called Pochteca. You'll see it spelled Pocteca too. And they are like walking people, right? Like, so they have like a whole bunch of stuff in their backpacks basically, and they walk from town to town. Now, they're not trading like food a lot or anything like that. They're mostly trading things that are relatively expensive kind of stuff. So, like, stone, like expensive stones or gems, or like, beautiful feathers or stuff like that. But these traders are the ones who are going to connect different parts of these towns together with each other. The Aztecs, of course, have this amazing system of agriculture called chinampas, which I'll show you a picture of in a second, which help to grow food to sustain large populations. One of the things that they did also is that while they have a tributary empire, they also left certain parts of the Aztec world out of that tributary empire so that they could continually fight wars against them. The idea here being that they need to capture slaves or military soldiers in order to sacrifice them. So if there are no more people to fight, that's a problem, right? Not to mention that their society, the major soldiers like the jaguar soldiers or the eagle soldiers, also needed somebody to fight. So these were called the flower wars, right? So they're going to start these little battles and conflicts and stuff in order to get slaves and to keep their military, in top shape, I guess. Eventually, these folks will fall to Cortez. That's going to occur after time period one. That'll be like 1515 or something. But they are going to fall to Hernan Cortez, who will, of course, famously invade them and kill Montezuma. All right. In the same time period here in kind of North America, or like Mexico area, we have the Mayans. They had really fallen from their height, really. About 900 to 1200 is really the height of the Mayan Empire, but they're still around. So, for example, Hernan Cortez has a translator named Malinche, who is a woman who comes with him, who speaks both. It's kind of crazy. Like, she speaks Nahuatl, the Aztec language. She also speaks the Mayan language. And then somebody else that he has speaks Mayan and also speaks Spanish. So it was like they would ask a question of the guy who speaks Spanish and Mayan to translate it to Mayan. He would translate it to Mayan, then she would translate it from Mayan to Aztec, and then back again. I cannot imagine that was a very good translation service, but apparently it got the job done. I think she eventually learned Spanish as well. But many states here, many city-states in the Mayans, they are ruled by these god kings who are in charge of everything. Again, sacrifice, they're not quite at the level of the Aztecs, but they definitely do have some human sacrifice there as well. One of the things that we have throughout this area is this thing called the Mesoamerican ball game. The Aztecs will play this as well. It goes all the way back to the Olmecs, to my memory. Originally starts off as basically a ceremonial game. So, like, it depicts the conflict between, I think it's like the sun god or something, and somebody else. And so they would play it as a ritual, essentially, right? Like, they already knew who's going to win and stuff, Gradually over time, people start liking this game a whole lot. So eventually they end up playing it more as a sport or for fun, and kind of like religious aspects of it fade a bit over time. We also have a lot of the Caribbean islands that have thriving civilizations, like the Taino, are another example of that. All right, remember, anytime, pop in a question. Let me know what I can do to help. Here's a couple pictures here for you. Over there on the left, that's your Aztec Empire. You can see Tenochtitlan up there in the north. It is in the middle of a lake called Lake Texcoco. You see how there's these kind of weird cutouts there, right? Those are the areas of kind of enemies, I guess, or whatever, that they would use to fight the Flower Wars. So they could just sort of travel across over to that group to the right and fight against them. Otherwise, though, you see how they have these different little cities, like down there at the bottom, Tehuantepec. That is a city that they enforce tribute from. So they don't have like direct control. They can't just tell them to do exactly what they want them to do, but they have the power and the control over that group. It's also kind of a cultural thing. Like, all these groups kind of agree to similar cultural values as well, but through tributaries is the key there. Up at the top right, then, that's our Mayans. You can see they had a whole bunch of these city-states, Tikal and Tulum and all, Chichen Itza and all these others, mostly up there in the, what is that thing called? The Yucatan Peninsula there, a part of Mexico. They do bleed over a little bit into places like Belize and stuff like that as well. Down the bottom there, that's going to be our chinampas. Okay. So again, they're kind of called like floating islands, but they're not that exactly. So you can see they're sort of like long kind of format there. And this is the process that they use from left to right, essentially. So on the left side there, they're going to put some stakes in the ground and put a woven reed wall. And then they're going to dump a whole bunch of stuff in there, right? Like all kinds of like agricultural waste and stuff until it starts building up. And some of it probably would actually float on the top, right? But as they do that, then all that water that's down there, that all the like has all the fish waste and stuff in it, that's really good for growing crops. That's all going to grow in there as well. Then you can see they're also going to plant these willow trees as a way to sort of like preserve it or keep it in shape. The middle part there, you can see that it's developing a bit. And then on the right, you can see it sort of at its full scale. It's no longer really like floating exactly. It's mud, manure, things like this, and they can revitalize it. But it has all this water as a form of like agricultural yeah, like watering and stuff. Okay. And they would use boats to go out to these little islands, and then they would collect their stuff and they would take it back, and they could produce a lot of food that way. So good stuff, Aztecs. All right. Next up, we're going down south to South America. Let's talk about the Incas in particular. So remember, there's people before the Incas. There's like a couple of other groups like the Mapuche and others. They have similar cultures, but the Incas are the big ones here because they're the ones with the biggest, most centralized empire. So the Incas are in South America, this very centralized empire. Remember, it's called almost like Incan socialism in the sense that everything was owned by the Inca or the emperor, and he sort of just let people use it basically over time. So essentially, they all the stuff essentially belonged to the emperor, and he could do what he wanted to. These folks are sun worshippers. They have like a god of the sun. They have other gods as well, but that's their primary one. They built a large road system to control the empire. This road system is called the Carpanan, and it had like one sort of like really long thing, and then all these little like branching parts off of it as well. It helped to control the empire. They also had like people who would run along the road every day. So like I forget the exact space, but it was like a person can run like this amount of miles in one day or whatever. And so they would have it set up between those where they would have little inns and stuff along the way. Very well organized. They don't have a language. The Aztecs and others do, but they don't have an actual written language. So one of the things they use to record information is something called a quipu. That is the roped knots kind of thing. Some people suggest it may have even been kind of a primitive writing system, but we don't really know. We know it's used to record information, though. They are going to use that labor system known as the mita. That is kind of a forced, kind of like labor tax. So you would sort of be required to work for maybe a month of the year on working on the road or something like that. The founder of the Incan system is called Pachacuti. And eventually the Incas will fall to Pizarro in this battle called the Battle of Cajamarca. All right. One thing also, this is not just the Incas. It's also used by a couple of others, but this is another interaction with the environment. There's a cultivation system called Waru Waru. Oh, yeah. So good. They named it twice. This is kind of similar to the system used by the Aztecs for the Chinampas. But in this case, it's more like mounds. Like they just sort of make these mounds that have like fish and stuff in between them. And so basically every year when they would refresh the ground, they would just sort of dredge the water canals and use all of the good stuff there to build it up, and it was another way that they could grow food. So you don't really need to know the details. Just know that if it asks for some reason about examples of like environmental stuff in the Americas, you could talk about Waru Waru. All right, let's go actually North America now real quick. So North America, not as well developed as far as like big empires and stuff. But they do have these Mississippian Indians, famous for building of mounds. Some of you have probably been to Moundville, though the biggest one is called Cahokia. They have a very loose organization. Most of these are pretty city-state-like. So like Moundville, for example, was mostly just on its own, though it had a few like little areas, but they're not like a big organized empire or anything. Now, in addition to these sort of larger empires like the Incas and Aztecs, there's a lot of other smaller groups that existed as well. So we talked about the Mapuche and others. Just make sure you know that it's not just these people and there's like nobody else living there. All right, pictures here for you. That is a quipu up there at the top. You can see there's like a line up here at the top that sort of holds them all together. And then you have multiple long lines here. And then there's knots at various locations. I don't know how to read it, but people apparently do. And they can tell you a little bit about it. Down here, that's a mound. If you've ever been to Moundville, you can go in there. These were used for burials as well as religious kind of ceremonies. Anytime in like history when you see something tall, that's usually a kind of religious worship thing, right? Like a lot of people believe that the gods were in the skies, so they would build these big tall temples and things. This is what these folks are doing. They're building big mounds where they can bury their dead, or they can like climb up to the top and try to communicate with the gods. Over on the right, you can see the development of the Inca civilization. You can see from the top to the bottom, it spread a lot over time. So, for example, Cuzco there is their capital, and that Pachacuti is going to be their first guy, 1438 to 1463, in that sort of orange zone there. Then with his assistant, Topa Inca, I think it's his son or something, they will expand up there in the north. Then Topa Inca will take a whole lot more territory, as you can see. And then we are going to have Hoya Capac will also develop and capture a few more as well. You can see it's kind of cool down there at the bottom, their imperial presence, right? So like direct control or like diverse types of control, etc. But throughout the majority of their empire, it is, again, a place that is that kind of Incan socialism there. All right. Is there any questions about Unit 1? Please let me know. Please. Anybody? Hey, we got more people in the crew. Thanks, Parker. Awesome. All right. The answer is no. Just keep working. Keep talking, Osborne. Keep getting things done. All right. Let's look at time period 2 then. 1450 to 1750, obviously, our big transition, big change here is going to be the uniting of the hemispheres. Columbus, of course, is the first to establish sustained contact. Remember, there are Vikings in like 800. There's some indication that maybe the Polynesians had made it to South America, but while they make it there, they don't really have a lasting impact to it. Columbus is the first one to make the sustained contact that continues on after he just simply sails through. So at that point, we have this sort of distinction of the quote-unquote old world or the new world. Again, it's mostly about where you live. If you're European, it's the Americas are the new world. One of the biggest problems, of course, is this issue of disease. So when Columbus and others come, they are going to start spreading certain diseases. This is known as the Columbian Exchange, of course. We've talked about it a million times. It's the movement of goods, crops, animals, and disease. So they're going to spread things like smallpox or mumps and measles, and that's going to kill an enormous number of Americans who did not have any sort of ability to defend themselves against that. So what happens then is that as the Europeans arrive, they are like, wow, this is amazing. There's this whole land where nobody really lives. We can just take it over. Oh, and also those natives, we're just going to like take over from them. So Spanish will set up these plantations. Disease amongst the enslaved natives, however, led to the beginning of the slave trade. Again, they tried to enslave the natives or get them to work, but the system didn't really work very well. Natives could escape very easily, and there also were not quite as many of them. So they'll start this slave trade. In addition, before they start the slave trade they do have the system called the Encomienda system that forced natives to work. The idea was that the Spanish government would give a little bit of like territory, very similar to like a feudal system or manorial system, to a person who was known as an encomiendero. They essentially were supposed to like teach the Indians about religion, and then they were also to and like help them out a bit. And in return, they were going to get some labor out of the Native Americans. What ends up happening instead, though, of course, is like kind of functional serfdom or slavery, where they would just work these people really hard. In Latin America, or that should say actually South America, sorry, the Mita system was used also. They just sort of adapted it from the Incas and made it work for the Europeans instead. Viceroys were put in charge in the Spanish areas due to all this like abuse and stuff. Same thing with like these things called audiencias that were designed to help deal with any sort of like problems that were caused by the Spanish, but they don't have a ton of effect necessarily. Never forget, don't sleep on the castas system. Okay, so the castas system is also going to be put into place. This is the sort of social system of the people of the Americas. So we have peninsulares at the top. It sounds like peninsula, and that's because it's about a peninsula. These are people who are born in Spain on the Iberian Peninsula. Then we have the Creoles. These folks are full-blooded Spanish. They are of European ancestry, but they are born in the Americas. That makes them, in the eyes of the Spanish and the Portuguese at least, a little less than the Peninsulares. Then we are going to have people of mixed race, mestizos and mulattoes, so Indian or black. And then we at the bottom have slaves and Indians. Now, look, you'll see a lot of different little versions of this. It does change over time a bit, but I mean, the same thing kind of holds, right? Like you have Europeans on the top, in particular Europeans from Europe. And then at the bottom, you're going to have slaves and Indians. And in the middle, you're going to have people of mixed descent. In a lot of places, like in North America, you don't really see people of mixed descent really having much of an, like they're not like in the main thing because there's not as many of them. And also, like the English, for example, had a sort of one drop kind of rule that if you like had a black mom or whatever, you were just instantly like black. You were like going to be enslaved and stuff. So it's unusual that in South America, at least, they didn't do that. And I think that's partly because, again, they don't have as many people to come and they have this huge territory to control. Treaty of Tordesillas allowed for the Portuguese control of Brazil. Again, while the Spanish and the Portuguese are exploring, they're kind of like having problems with each other, and so they ask the Pope to intervene. The Pope gives Portuguese control of Brazil and essentially all the trade of the Indian Ocean, and in return, the Spanish get the Americas. At the time, it was kind of thought that the Portuguese got away with something here, but of course, as we know, in the long run, not so much. Over here on the left, we got Encomienda, the plan and the reality. The Spanish claimed the Encomienda system would benefit both settlers and Indians, but it doesn't work that way. The plan was that Spanish settlers protect, care for, and Christianize Indians, and the Indians would work a portion of their time for Spanish settlers. That sounds all right. The reality, however, Spanish settlers force long labor, don't pay Indian workers, fail to protect lands, and seize Indian lands. And the Indians will die from disease and harsh living and working conditions. Eventually, that system will end because, like, literally the church is like, this is terrible. So the clergy will protest, Indians revolt against it. However, there's a brief system, don't worry about learning it, but this thing called a repartimiento that is put in instead that is designed to help out or change that a bit. Over on the right, we have a zoom in of that picture of all the things going back and forth. This is, of course, our Colombian exchange. At the top, we got avocados from Mexico, got peppers, cassava, cacao bean, squash, pineapple, peanuts, tomatoes, corn, beans, vanilla, potatoes. On the other side, then we got grape, turnip, onion. Gosh, turnip. We sent turnips over here. That's terrible. Onion, sugarcane, honeybees, bananas, olives, citrus fruits, peach and pears, coffee beans. That was a useful one. And then we got all the grains, livestock, etc. But over on the right, you can see the beginning there of smallpox, influenza, typhus, and measles. So again, a lot of commercial crops, really, right? Like we're sending over there things like sugarcane and stuff that people can raise to make money off of. All right, continuing on here with time period 2. Let's finish this bad boy up. North America has the foundation of colonies by the Europeans, so British, French, Dutch, and Spanish. Each had different reasons for settling. So, like, for example, the British wanted permanence. They wanted to establish colonies where they could grow food and they could get, like, raw resources and materials. Things like wood and stuff like that, right? The French really want trading posts. Okay, they're just all about money is really what they want. Like they don't want to settle permanently, so they're going to create cities like New Orleans, which, while it is a permanent settlement, is primarily a settlement for trading. So like the French would go off into the woods and like find some furs and then bring them back down to the trading posts, but they're not necessarily establishing much in the way of settlements. The few settlements they establish are really trading posts like Detroit or St. Louis, stuff like that. A series of wars led to consolidation into the British. So the British are going to control these areas because of these wars. One of the biggest ones in the North American continent is the French and Indian War, which is part of the 7 Years' War. It gave Britain a lot of control over the continent, so that is going to help out a lot. Also, at this time period, we, of course, have the Atlantic system, so moving of people and goods around the Atlantic. That is, again, where we go from North America to Europe with our raw materials. Those are processed then. They are sold to Africans who then sell slaves to people, and they go across the ocean to the Americas. British system of mercantilism will alienate the Americans and lead to the war for independence. Make sure we know what mercantilism is. It is the predecessor to capitalism. The primary difference they are both concerned with like trade and stuff, but it really has a lot to do with like the focus of it. So in the focus of mercantilism, the focus is the health of the state, like of the government, so that the government can make money, which helps people make money within the country, right? On the other hand, capitalism says it's not about the government necessarily that to regulate trade. It's about the free market to do so instead. So mercantilism is concerned with the government and its success, whereas capitalism is concerned with the success of the capitalists, like the people who own things, and they argue that therefore the government as well as the people will do well otherwise. So like you don't need to have that specific leadership. And of course, we end up having the War for Independence of the Americans, which we win. Take that, Britain. I like this picture over on the left. It comes up every time you look for mercantilism, and it makes me smile. I just love the look on the lady's face. Oh, for me, I would love some foodstuffs and some raw material. So that's your mother country over there on the left, and then you have these servants, like literal servants, like America or whatever, are going to be serving the country, and so they're going to have gold and silver, foodstuffs, raw materials. All this stuff is coming over to the mother country. And over on the right, you can see another little kind of like graph for that. European trade with their colonies. We got the mother country, which has manufactured goods and high prices, which they sell to the colonies. The colonies then are forced to sell their gold, silver, fur, lumber, and foodstuffs back to the mother country for low prices. And again, they can't trade with other people either, right? Like the British, that whole thing about tea, like the biggest thing about that was that the colonies really wanted to be able to import their own tea and coffee and stuff, but the British wouldn't let them. They had to purchase the British tea instead. So British tea was more expensive. Now, hilariously, it's way better quality. Like a lot of these early founders and stuff were like selling, like they're advocating for selling like products. Like they're like, well, we should be able to trade tea and do whatever we want, right? But they're making like really bad tea. Like it's just really terrible. It's like basically just stuff they stole or something. Whereas the British government's like, yeah, okay, our tea is expensive, but it's like good. It's like, tea, So anyway, just an example of what they're doing. All right, that is going to be our time period 2. What do we got? Somebody asked me a question. I feel like I'm just talking to myself. I'm like living in the computer here. What do we got? Anything, just something. It doesn't even have to be about the topic. I just want somebody to talk to me. All right, here we go. Good. Thank you, Logan. A plus, A plus. How successful were the Spanish and others in converting Native Americans to Christianity, and what effects did this have? Yeah, the answer is they were pretty good at it, right? Like, I mean, I think part of it is that when the Native Americans saw that their countries could be pretty easily conquered by the Europeans, and ultimately that a lot of their like religious books are burned and stuff like that, that they are going to, I guess, decide that maybe Christianity is going to be good for them. Don't forget too that they are going to adapt it a little bit. So much like we talked about with African groups or whatever, same thing's going on here. So like the Virgin of Guadalupe is an example of a sort of native perspective on Christianity. So yeah, they were pretty effective on actually converting the natives to Christianity. What effects did it have? Well, I mean, just the obvious, basically that they became Christians. They would build churches. It helped to keep control of the native populations probably a little bit more, stuff like that. Do I like tea? Allison, I do enjoy tea as far as like sweet tea and stuff, like cold tea, iced tea. My wife is a big hot tea fan, which I'm not as much. I like hot coffee, don't like hot tea. Doesn't make any sense. Life is weird. Thank you for the questions, kiddos. If you got any more, please feel free, toss them in there. Let's take a look at time period 3 then. Revolts and revolutions, inspired by the Enlightenment. There's going to be a whole bunch of groups fighting for independence. Specifically, one of the big things we're looking at here is Creoles versus Peninsulares in Latin America, the old world versus the new, in a sense. And also the rise of these guys called caudillos, which is like a strong man within Latin America. So, you're going to have like, I don't know if, I guess you qualify Simon Bolivar maybe as one of these guys, but it's basically just people who have a lot of power and, want to be sort of dictators, essentially. But remember, the Enlightenment says that everybody has equal rights, or that every human being is built in the eyes of God. So like, why can't they be independent, right? So one of the big factors here then too is that the Creoles, the people who are born in the New World but are actually of descent of Europeans, believe that they are the ones who should be in charge in the New World, and that every time they have some Peninsulare appointed as a viceroy, it makes them mad, and they want to be in control of things. So that's one of the things that's going to inspire a lot of these revolutions. So again, debatable on the Haitian Revolution being in Latin America, but it is certainly a part of America. So Haitian Revolution, these are super short on these revolutions because, again, we could go for a long time. But Haitian Revolution, late 19th century. Again, this is Toussaint Louverture, is our most famous guy here. He again gets captured and killed during the course of the war, but his followers carry it on, and eventually we'll get in Haitian independence. So again, it takes about 9 years for them to fight this war and get independence. There's multiple phases of this conflict. Napoleon gets involved at one point. But the problem with it is that by the end of it, though, the whole country is just devastated. Like a lot of the slaves who were rising up against the French government were unhappy with working in these plantations, so they would often destroy those plantations, which meant that they didn't have the ability to make money or whatever. So like they're just sort of having a lot of trouble dealing with the situation, and so that will cost a lot for Haitian independence. Don't forget too that after they get independent, like nobody wants to deal with them because it's a successful slave revolt. So for like people in the south of the United States, that particularly was a terrifying result. For Latin America, then we have these two guys, Simon Bolivar and Jose de San Martin. So in the north, think Venezuela, that is where Simon Bolivar is going to operate. In the south, around Argentina, is where Jose de San Martin will operate, and they'll kind of meet in the middle. They also have this guy, one of my favorite names in all of history. He's a he is a Spanish like leader, but he is descended from Irish people that moved to Latin America, and his name, I swear, is Bernardo O'Higgins, which is just a phenomenal name. I love it. So good. I think there should be. I think I need to like learn more about Bernardo O'Higgins. But anyway, Bernardo and his friends Simon Bolivar and Jose de San Martin are going to basically oust the Spanish from Latin America, or from South America, I should say, free North and South America from the Spanish. They will try to forge these into big countries, right? So like Simon Bolivar will be in charge of a country called Gran Colombia, which was a combination of Colombia as well as Venezuela and a few other places. But ultimately, it does not really work very well. Like they don't like each other very much. Like individual little towns are slightly different from each other. There's different Creoles who want independence or power. And so ultimately that will fall apart into the countries that we know of today. Brazil's a weird one. It has a peaceful exit, so there's no conflict, no military fighting here. As a member of the royal family of Portugal, sorry, that should be capitalized, he just declares it his own country. So remember, there's a whole lot of action here from Napoleon, like the overthrow of the Spanish throne is why we have these Latin American independence movements. And also for Brazil, the same thing is going on. Like Napoleon basically chases the royal family of Portugal out. They go to Brazil, they then go back after the conflict, but they leave their son, and he's like, "I'm the emperor now," and he declares himself the emperor instead. So a little bit of an unusual one. This would be like a kind of question you might see would be something along the lines of like, describe some of the revolutions in the Americas and like compare how they get independence or whatever. So this would be something that you could do. You could talk about like the Haitian Revolution, that they get independence, though it has this cost, right? Whereas there's like military conflicts for a couple of them, but Brazil is peaceful, right? Like those kind of things are things that you would maybe be able to tie together into some kind of essay. You might see something like that. All right, look at that guy, man. He is such a cutie. I love it. That is Simone de Bolivar over there on the right. He's got some good vibes going there. He's got a lovely collar, though it looks a little stiff. But he is the guy that's going to help make people independent. Look over there on the left. You can see a couple of different activities that are going on, and you can sort of see where they're going, particularly Bolivar, right? So like the south down here, you can see as well with like Argentina. So you see 1817 to 1818, we got San Martin and O'Higgins are going to, they declare independence in Argentina. They will move over to Chile, where O'Higgins will be elected. In Paraguay at 1811, we're going to have the overthrow of the Spanish governor. And then you will see Martin and San Martin and Higgins are going to move north towards Peru, where they will meet up with Simón de Bolivar. So Simón de Bolivar up there in Angostura. 1819, Bolivar goes to Bogota. He creates his country there of Gran Colombia. And then he will also move down into Peru, because like Peru is like the main area of the Spanish. That's where they control all of Latin America through. So they're eventually going to make their way down there, and they will kind of meet in the middle, and they will free Peru and free the entirety of the continent then. So this is in like 1828. You can see all the different countries that are there. Bolivia, this territory is separated out and named. Some of these are going to move around a little bit. Brazil gets its independence again in 1822. We do still have some colonies in like British Guiana, Dutch Guiana, and French Guiana. Mostly those are just like because they're other countries. They're not Spanish, and also they're kind of small. They don't have a lot of people in them necessarily. So that's a key feature there for that. All right. So let's go a little bit farther north, though, here for the Mexican Revolution. This revolution is going to take place in like 1811, I think, 1810, which will start with this thing called the Cry of Dolores. This is going to be Father, oh man, I almost had it. Let me think about it. Anyway, Father Hidalgo is his name. Okay, so he is a Catholic priest. Good question from before about conversions to Christianity, but a lot of the priests and others lived with the Native Americans. So they realized how badly the Spanish were treating them. So he has this sort of like uprising in this town of Dolores, and they are quickly put down. But it does start this process of a Mexican Revolution, and they will eventually get their independence in like the early 18th century. I forget exactly when, but they will overthrow the Spanish authorities there as well, and they will get their independence. I think it's 1821. In both Latin America and North America, then, a demand for cheap goods will drive people crazy. So Declaration of Independence will cause the United States to get independence. In the U.S. War for Independence, America becomes the strongest force in North America at this point. We will then have a series of expansions like the Louisiana Purchase, which will lead to the United States controlling most of the continent. Obviously, this issue of slavery will end up leading to the U.S. Civil War, which is a big event that takes place. After the war, America industrializes even more and joins the race for imperialism, but in a bit more limited capacity. They're more economic imperialists, right? So they're going to have things like the United Fruit Company, which will create quote unquote banana republics as they push people around. They also have the Monroe Doctrine, which will cause them to basically oppose any European expansion in Latin America. It essentially says, look, this is our place to deal with. We do have some resistance to this, though. So resistance like Tupac Amaru in Peru is an attempt to kind of resist against the powerful authorities there. That is a very short little discussion there. So if you have other questions, please let me know. Put those in the thing. That is the end of time period 3. Let me know what you think if you got questions. This is America, of course. That's America, or in the United States. You can see our expansions then, of course. We have our original 13 colonies, and then we are going to have the opening after the... So one of the reasons they went to war was that there's all this territory, which is like modern day, like Tennessee and Alabama, that they were not allowed to settle because it was Native American territory. So after the Independence War, they opened that up. So we start having Americans move out there in 1783, and they start to settle. Eventually, of course, we will have the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 under Thomas Jefferson. He will purchase that territory and create this whole new area out there. Okay, so St. Louis, we've got Lewis and Clark who are going to come that way. As they try to expand. We got annexed Mexico. We got Tejas, and we've never recovered from it. That's 1845. We have ceded by Mexico in 1848 for us. This little bit called the Oregon Country in 1846. You can see we're buying a whole lot. And then 1853, we got the Gadsden Purchase. Now, at the end of the 19th century, we will also add Hawaii as well as Alaska, and we will have a couple of other places or positions around in that area as well. Expansion. Anybody else got any questions here up to this point? We're gonna move on to time period 4 then. Anything? I agree, Logan. Hot tea is mid. It's the light mode of teas. All right. Let's check it out then. Time period 4, 1900 to the present. In Mexico, we have another revolution. Okay, so what happens is Mexico gets its independence, of course, in this time period. But in the process, it ends up having a couple of different things. They have like little democracies, but then they'll end up having these strongmen, these caudillos, these dictators will take charge. So, for example, Porfirio Diaz is going to be elected in the 19th century, and initially starts out okay, but by 1911 or so, he is in charge, and he is not a great guy. This guy named Francisco Madero will run against him. He will win, but Diaz kind of fakes the election and says it's not true and puts Madero in jail. That's going to lead to a revolution in 1911. That's when it starts. The full end of it will not happen until 1921. There's like about a 10-year kind of conflict that's kind of hot and cold over time of lots of different people. So like some of Diaz's supporters will keep fighting a bit. But yeah, by 1921, that is changed around. So this is all the stuff about like World War I and II. Like we're not going to do a ton of details here. Besides the United States and Canada, really, the rest of the continent doesn't get hugely involved in World War I and World War II. Like, I mean, sure, like Brazil sends some troops or something, like, 100 dudes in World War II or something like that. Like there's lots of that kind of stuff. Like the United States asked for help with like raw materials or something, right? So there's lots of little things like that that are going to occur in Latin America or other places where they're going to spend, like they're going to help out the United States. But as far as like kind of major key events in World War I or World War II, in places that are not Canada or the United States, pretty minimal. The United States, of course, is involved in World War II, as is Canada. Canada does fight very honorably in World War I and World War II. The United States will join in 1907 due to many reasons, including submarine warfare and, of course, the Zimmerman telegram. This telegram was sent to Mexico, supposedly claiming that Mexico could have parts of America if they helped fight against them by the Germans. It was probably garbage, but it really upset a lot of Americans. All right, after that war, between the wars, the United States, we have the global downturn, which does affect Latin America as well. But the United States and some other countries are going to do these kind of purchasing programs like the New Deal, which is, of course, based on Keynesian economics. The United States is involved in World War II as well as the Cold War. Again, very similar circumstances. The World War II is one that the Latin American countries assist but don't really get involved in as much. The Cold War, on the other hand, is a little bit more. Okay, so during the Cold War, Cuba, of course, is taken over by communists under Fidel Castro. And in the process of doing so, that really upsets the United States. This is 1953. And that will lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Basically, the Soviets will want to put missiles in Cuba because it's very close to the United States. The United States doesn't want that. We stand them off, we win. But in the long run, it does have some consequences. But that Cuban Missile Crisis is a key focus of the policies there. In Nicaragua, we also, a group called the Sandinistas, were aligned with communism. And so we funded their opponents called the Contras. So there's a couple of examples here where Latin America was involved in the Cold War. We also, like in 1981 or something, we also invaded Grenada under Reagan because they supposedly were also communists. That's an island in the Lesser Antilles. But those are all examples of kind of Cold War involvement by Latin America. Okay. All right, little picture here for you, okay? This picture over the left is pretty hilarious. So there's the United States at the top, right? And then we have coups with U.S. involvement. So in Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, I think that's what, Guatemala up there in Central America and stuff like that. There were overthrows of the government that the United States supported. We also have U.S. invasions. Again, these are colors I can't see very well, but I'm pretty sure we got what, like Haiti. I know we invaded Haiti like 100 times. Haiti, Dominican Republic. We got, what is that, Nicaragua, and I think that's Panama. So those are all examples of that. Where we had invasions and then attempted coups with U.S. involvement. That's primarily going to be in Cuba. We kept trying to like kill people and do the Bay of Pigs as well. Over on the right, then you can see some leftists in Latin America, dirty, stinking leftists. We got communist government, of course, in Cuba, leftist-leaning governments allied with Cuba, like Venezuela. We have left-leaning governments in a couple of other places. This is kind of more modern-day kind of situations. Leftist electoral elections on the rise, important mass-based social movements, etc. So you can see sort of like the more leftist swing of Latin America over time. All right, time period 4 then. I'm just throwing this in there because it was mentioned on by Ben Freeman, but we do have one example of a independence movement that's in sort of North America, which is the Quebecois independence movement. All y'all in French, right? Woo woo. This is a part of Canada that speaks French. Was historically settled by the French. They have repeatedly tried to get some sort of independence, but most of the time the independence movement votes don't work. Like, you know, Canada is like kind of, well, we'll see about it. Like, I imagine if like 100% of Quebec voted to be independent, then Canada would be like, yeah, we'll deal with that. That's fine. But every time it's like 48% or something. You know what I mean? Like, it's real like on the margins, and so Quebec ends up staying in the government. There's still like a mild Quebec independence movement, but it's not huge. But that's an example of these independence movements. In Latin America, Augusto Pinochet is one of these sort of caudillos over time, and he's going to overthrow a democratically elected but communist government, and he will rule as an authoritarian. We also have communist rebels in Peru called the Shining Path that will fight the government. Eventually, they will fall apart. We also got the fall of the Berlin Wall, of course, which will lead to the United States having some success. A lot of Unit 9 stuff here, but that's kind of true everywhere. So like globalization has a big effect. A couple of the words that I could find, like terms and stuff that looked useful here for us. NAFTA is a free trade agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement. And then, of course, things like the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which is passed in America, would be an example of some of this like rights-based discussions and stuff that we see in the United States. All righty. That is my little presentation here. What do we have for questions? We got about 10 minutes. Let's try to push this out maybe 5 more, but just some good content-based questions, or if you have something else specific that you really want to talk about, just let me know. Let's toss a couple questions in there before we end up tonight. Who's got something? Yeah, so one of the biggest effects of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Alana, is that the Soviet Union becomes much more hardline, right? Like, so Khrushchev is the guy who's going to be in charge at the time. He had taken over from Stalin. He was doing de-Stalinization. Like, he's like, yeah, that Stalin guy's terrible. I hate that guy. So he was a bit more of a, like, kind of a mid-range kind of guy, right? So the problem, though, is that once the United States stands off the Soviets at the Cuban Missile Crisis, the military and the government of the Soviet Union is like, well, these guys are like not going to ever do anything for us, right? Like we have to be more hardline about it. So in the long run, then one of the effects is that it's going to cause more hardline, positions. Another one you could probably say is that it continues America's sort of obsession with Cuba. So we try to assassinate Fidel Castro a whole bunch, hilariously, like with like exploding cigars and stuff. And we also have this policy towards Cuban refugees that if they come to the United States, then they get to be U.S. citizens. So we have enormous numbers of Cubans in Florida. Those kind of things would be examples of some of the effects of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Good question. All right, let's see. Parker, hypothetically, if there was a question on a certain time period, say 1450 to 1750, could you use a piece of evidence that overlaps time periods? Oh, good question. Kind of like how Emperor Qianlong is in periods 1450, 1750, and 1750, 1900. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's not a problem. So the time periods that they've chosen are designed to sort of avoid that, right? Like these time periods should not have major like overlaps necessarily. So like for example, 1450 is right before Columbus, right? So like we have a little bit of a break there before that takes place. But like, are there people worshiping Huitzilopochtli in 1500 in Latin America or in the Aztecs? Yeah, sure. It's just that they're not as important because they're being like, taken out by the Spanish or whatever. Okay. So yeah, so you could definitely do that. There's not as many important ones, but if that's something that comes up, like if you're thinking about it, then sure, put it in there. I would also say put it in there anyway, right? Because you're not going to be harmed by that detail. It can only potentially give you points when it comes to evidence. So yeah, sure, do that. Good question. What else we got? What else we got? Come on. One more. One more. Who else has one? Somebody's got to have some. Ooh. How did the Encomienda system affect stuff? Allison, do you write for the College Board? That sounds like a College Board kind of question there, right? Yeah. Well, so it's more about like the failure of the encomienda system, right? Like the encomienda system doesn't work very well. Again, because the Native Americans can flee or because they're being mistreated or whatever, that kind of stuff. So because the encomienda system fails, that is going to lead to an expansion of things like slavery, right? So while slavery existed during the encomienda system and while slaves, the slave trade was going on and stuff like that, it wasn't as big necessarily. But once they realized that they're going to need more and more people, that's when it expands. I should actually clarify that a bit. So a lot of the Caribbean islands, the Native American groups were like literally wiped out. So like if you went to Haiti, like there were no Native Americans there, so they couldn't even do an encomienda kind of system. Not to mention it's also French, but you know what I mean. So there were already slaves in those kind of places, but the places where there were natives, they didn't necessarily need a lot of slavery. So that's going to change then when the encomienda system essentially fails. I think you could also argue that it affected it by putting the Native Americans in a position where they would need to be Christianized. So that would probably also expand the Christianity kind of situation there. But that would probably be the best answers to a random question that I like, but is not as focused as I probably need. All right. Folks, we'll go ahead and call it there. We got just a couple minutes left. Hopefully this was helpful to y'all. Thanks for showing up. I appreciate it. I'm going to post this up on the internet if you, for some reason, want to watch it again. I don't know why you do that. I will see all of y'all tomorrow in class, and I just hope you're doing great out there. Okay. We will see y'all next time. If for some reason you have a question, you want to hang around for a second, feel free. Okay. Talk to y'all later. Bye-bye.